Many of you know that I had a very strong passion for talking about complex PTSD, specifically childhood PTSD, and the nature of what I've often called silent trauma, toxic hypervigilance, basically a trauma personality that when you have a certain childhood, it's sort of hard to understand who could you have been, what traits and qualities might you have had you not grown up in those environments. And for me, I don't know. Both of my parents were what I've called eggshell type parents who really struggled with their own emotional regulation. My father had severe trauma as a child, which I believe led to him deciding to not be here anymore when I was 23. That was, of course, incredibly traumatic for me, and not to mention the relationship or lack thereof one we'd had. My mother, as I've talked about, I do believe, although I'm starting to question a few things about her difficulties, I do believe has lived her life with undiagnosed borderline, but she did not really have an identifiably traumatic childhood. Not in the ways that we talk about even complex PTSD or the types of traumas that might create borderline. Now, that being said, we know that these disorders, whatever you want to call them, I don't love that word, they're incredibly complex. And I do not think that we are anywhere near, I think we're at the very beginning of understanding the dynamics between our brains and our environments and how things play out. And there's been a lot of conversation around the overlap and often misdiagnoses and confusing diagnoses around borderline, complex PTSD, autism, ADHD, and even narcissistic personality disorder. And so I've been doing a deep dive specifically on understanding autism. Now, the dive I'm doing is specifically targeted to understanding what I guess would now be called level 1 autism. The way that autism might be related and not related to what we would think of today as often symptoms of complex PTSD, especially around things that I've talked about like hypervigilance, sensory issues, being sensitive. And I sort of am, I've spent about 25 hours in the last several days doing a deep dive. I read the book called Unmasking Autism over the weekend. I've been on a ton of websites, a ton of research articles. I've ordered a couple more books. I've got the book Neurotribes I'm reading right now. And I got ordered 2 more books on the presentation of autism in females. But the books are a bit older. And so I still think they're valuable, but they also don't necessarily seem to address what I'm trying to understand, which is what is the possibility that someone like myself or any of you may have in addition to or related to level 1 types of autistic traits. Maybe they're just subclinical traits. Maybe they're the actual full diagnosis as it relates to our complex, what we thought or maybe related to our complex PTSD symptoms. And you can see how I'm kind of like fumbling over my words because I'm at the beginning of this inquiry. As a psychologist, what you need to understand if you don't know about this field is that it's so broad and vast that in our programs, for example, with something like autism, unless we're seeking out a specific training or course, we don't get an understanding of that. In fact, if that is going to be your specialty, let's say as a psychologist, you're going to do a lot of extra trainings and coursework and books and reading. And so for someone like me, I've done a lot of trainings on childhood trauma, on complex PTSD, on anxiety, relationships, things like that.